Let me do that. Hi, I'm Mary Bethel. I'm the board chair for the North Carolina Coalition on Aging. And we thought it would be interesting to record a little bit of a history about the Coalition on Aging. A lot of folks think it's an organization that's only been around for 10 or 15 years, but it really has a very proud tradition. The seeds for the Coalition on Aging actually got started in the late 70s, early 80s. The North Carolina Division of Aging became an official agency of state government in the late 1970s. And in the early 80s, there was a director that came on board who had been a former legislator named Ernest Messer. And he really thought that there needed to be advocacy efforts around aging if things were going to move forward in the state. So he talked with a lot of people in the state about coming together, some people that were in leadership positions. And some of these leaders actually started meeting about, I think, 1981 or so. Dr. Ellen Winston was one of those. She was a pioneer in North Carolina in human services. She'd been head of the state welfare agency, and she also was the secretary of HEW at the time. I believe it was in the Kennedy administration. Then Ann Johnson, who was also, her name is known to many people in North Carolina. She, the Senior Center Institute, the Division of Aging and Adult Services currently does, is named for her. She was a pioneer. Phil Brown, who was executive director of the Pennock Home, that was a continuing care retirement facility and it still is, was also another person. So they, along with Mr. Messer, would meet together periodically just to share information, talk about things, what they thought ought to be done. I've jokingly told some folks that lots of times there was alcohol involved in these meetings. They would meet at some nice place in Raleigh and kill a bottle of wine, except for Mr. Messer, who was a teetotaler. But it was a lively group and a very prestigious group that came together. There was an interest in doing more to formalize this effort, and that really began to take shape in the late 80s, early 90s, and went through a series of very high-profile leaders for trying to get people together in the state that were interested in aging. Ann Johnson, who I've mentioned previously, was involved in that effort. We had folks like Dee and Dick Hatch, who were key leaders in ARP North Carolina. Polly Williams, who had been an English professor at North Carolina State, but was a strong advocate with the North Carolina Justice Center, was also a big leader. And we had Jean Reeves, who was executive director of an adult daycare center in Halifax County, and Roxanne Bragg Cash, who was a senior center director in Lewisburg. And all those folks kind of served in leadership roles as president of the organization through the 1990s. So it was still fairly loosely organized, but folks were coming together by this time to meet once a month for a 2-hour meeting on Friday afternoons at the North Carolina Division of Aging. They would share information. They would sometimes talk about key issues going on. Once in a while, they'd have a keynote speaker on a key issue. But it was still, it was organized, but not like it is today. The group even developed bylaws, and they actually produced a legislative agenda every year. Now, they didn't do a whole lot with it through the 1990s, but they did distribute it to the General Assembly just to let elected officials know what the top priorities were. It wasn't until about 2011 or so that things really began to move in the direction we see the Coalition on Aging going today. Bill Lamb was elected as president of the Coalition on Aging in 2011. And he had a real strong feeling that aging interest in North Carolina needed to get better organized. We need to have more people at the table if we were going to move that needle. And he did a lot to help to institutionalize a lot of the ways we did business. The membership began to grow at that time. Up until that point, the membership dues had been about $20 a year for agencies and organizations. And quite frankly, anybody could join. You could join as an individual, you could join as an agency or organization or whatever. But it became a more formalized process. And I believe the dues, I think at that point, they were increased a little bit. I came on board as the president in September of 2015. And by that time, everybody at the table was saying, you know, we've got to have a bigger presence for aging in North Carolina. Our footprint's got to be bigger than what it is now. Just look at the demographics for the state. So we began to do things like pull together serious discussions about financial sustainability for an organization, and we wanted to grow it. We needed to look at things like becoming a 501c3. So we put in place all the mechanics for getting these types of things in place. And we talked about growing our membership, and we increased our agency organization dues significantly at that point. And I don't think there was anybody that we lost as a member. I think that our members were beginning to see that we had really good return on investment for what we were trying to do, and that it was something that was worth individual and agency organization participation. We established two classes of membership. We had agency organization members, and we also had individual members. As we move forward, we realized that what we had on our agenda and what we wanted to accomplish was more than just a volunteer position. So in August of 2017, I became a part-time executive director. Up to that point, I'd been volunteer, and I stayed in that role until December of 2020. And it was just a very nominal amount that I was being paid every month. Basically, it was pretty much pro bono work, but I think I and other people were committed to the cause and felt that we needed to do all this background work in order to get things up and running. So in January of 2020, we hired our first full-time executive director, Allison Costanzo. She helped to really get things off on a firm footing. She ended up staying about 6 months. I believe policy work probably was not exactly her cup of tea. And I mean, you were wearing a lot of hats. You were doing membership, you were doing policy, you were doing advocacy, you were doing education. So a very broad set of responsibilities. And then when she left in the summer of 2020, our current executive director, Heather Burkhart, came on board, and Heather brought a great deal of experience from working at the State Division of Aging and Adult Services, it was called now at this point, as deputy director, along with a lot of experience at the local level. And she currently serves in that position. So I think what we have today is an organization that hopefully is very responsive to members. Members get a lot of support. We have monthly meetings. We have other educational engagement opportunities that go on all the time during the month. We do a lot of sharing and networking. Heather does a great job of sending out information and updates about things going on so that people are in the know about what's going on. And we do a lot of legislative policy work to make sure that the agenda of the coalition is before policymakers in the state. Today, there's over 90 agency organization members, and I believe about 60 individual members. So you can see the organization has really grown. And quite frankly, I think we do have a pretty good sized footprint now, as evidenced by the fact that a lot of action was taken on our legislative agenda this last session by the General Assembly. So we hope to continue to grow the organization. We think that one of the real assets that we have as an organization is the diversity of our membership. We've got groups that represent consumers, providers, and advocates, as well as individuals members. We've got those all the way from group who work in group care facilities or have trade associations for group care facilities, to those that are advocates for residents in facilities, and those that do day-to-day operation and programming. So we think that is a real asset, that all those with diverse interests have come together for the common interest of aging in North Carolina. So we think it's a pretty good story, one that's still evolving, but that has a proud history and tradition.